Sophia Stamatopoulou-Robbins. She is an associate professor of anthropology at Bard College. She's interested in infrastructure, waste, environment, colonialism, austerity, and platform capitalism. Her first book, about which she will talk with us today, Waste, Siege, The Life of Infrastructure in Palestine, from Stanford University Press 2009, won the Middle East Studies Association's Albert Hourani Book Award in 2020. Her current book, Homing Austerity, Airbnb in Athens, is under contract with Duke University Press, and it examines how Airbnb is transforming the relationship between subjectivity, real estate, work, and aesthetics. Her work also appeared in several journals and has received support from national and international funding agencies. Sophia, we are looking forward to your talk today.
Thank you so much. And I'm just going to share my screen so that we're watching something interesting while I'm speaking. Let me see. This seems good, right? Or maybe I can do play so it's nicer. Okay, great. So I should say the book came out in 2019. So it's kind of recent, although it's interesting how time passes, and very quickly after your book comes out, you think about all kinds of updates you would like to add. Okay, so thank you so much for the invitation and for being here today to everyone. Special thanks to Yael Elmog and the Center for Culture and Ecology for the invitation. And I'm really looking forward to our discussion after the talk. So I begin with the premise that Palestinians in the Israeli-occupied West Bank are surrounded by what for Palestinian society are unprecedented types and volumes of waste that are also inescapable. I call this condition a waste siege, and I argue that this emergent yet overlooked siege shapes politics and ethics in Palestine in unexpected ways. Unwanted things are increasingly important actors, mediating and complicating life at multiple scales. I conducted fieldwork between 2007 and 2016 with a continuous 2.5-year stay between 2009 and 2012. My book posits waste as worlding and contingent, and therefore proposes that even in a place where life is dominated by settler colonial militarism and neoliberal statecraft, that domination and experiences of it are both mediated by historically specific forms and ways of managing refuse. Today, I'll discuss two features of waste siege. In the first part, I'll talk about circularity to demonstrate why I think siege is an apt term for how waste works in Palestine. In the second part, I'll discuss how infrastructures and what I call infrastructural forms help us understand waste siege. The three examples on which I draw are: 1, the Palestinian Authority's first West Bank sanitary landfill; 2, waste dumping in Shukba village; and 3, bread abandoned out of doors. These examples show how waste besieges different people differently and at different scales. Before going on, I'd like to provide some historical context. Palestine's waste siege resulted from a historical conjuncture in the past 2 decades. When Israel occupied the West Bank in 1967, it took over Palestinians' healthcare, education, infrastructure, and the economy. In the mid-1990s, Israel signed an agreement in Oslo with the Palestine Liberation Organization that, among other things, created the Palestinian Authority, which I'll be referring to today as the PA. Israel maintained full military control over the territory, while the PA became responsible for Palestinian civilian life, including waste management on fragments of it. As you can see in this map, these fragments amount to roughly 30% of the West Bank and are non-contiguous. The PA has never been able to create adequate distance between the roughly 3 million West Bank Palestinians and wastes, be that Palestinians' own wastes or Israeli-produced wastes. So part 1, which is the long part, circularity. The phrase waste siege conveys a sense of surroundedness, a sense that life without wastes is inconceivable. My formulation complicates the definition of waste as matter out of place, as some have defined it following anthropologist Mary Douglas's famous definition of dirt, which renewed the argument of philosopher and psychologist William James that dirt was a matter of classification. For Palestinians, waste is not so much out of place as it is matter with no place to go. It remains present even when it changes form or location. Picture a piece of used toilet paper in a windowless prison cell. You can crumple it, step on it, rip it apart, move, or even eat it, but you cannot in a meaningful sense get rid of it. This makes waste siege generative. Any attempt to address the ethical, political, or practical dilemmas that waste creates, or equally to capitalize on the opportunities it opens up, results in the redistribution and reformulation of waste's dilemmas rather than in their eradication. The PA's first West Bank sanitary landfill demonstrates how waste in Palestine besieges, even in what we might think of as the ideal scenario, when an infrastructure is successfully erected to dispose of it en masse. Under encouragement from its international donors, on whom most of its budget depends, the PA opened the landfill in 2007. In many ways, Zahrat al-Finjan landfill looks like a typical landfill. It's a crater cut into a piece of agricultural land south of Jenin, where it occupies an area of roughly 44.5 acres. Landfills are the most common method of waste disposal worldwide. Landfills allow people in general not to think about their trash. But unlike many other contexts where landfills are uncharismatic, unspectacular infrastructures, even for those who manage them, in Palestine they carry a surprising, if dirty and contested, sheen. The Oslo negotiations had implied that the PA would eventually turn into a Palestinian state, but only if it could demonstrate readiness for statehood to the international community, including Israel. Readiness, I learned, includes evidence that the PA will protect the environment, which the Accords framed as an environment shared between Israel and the PA. This sharedness of the environment became justification for continued Israeli involvement in Palestinian waste management and generated an imperative for Palestinians to construct sanitary infrastructures of particular kinds. Since its establishment, the PA has thus sought to use landfills to replace long-standing garbage management systems comprised of hundreds of smaller dump sites that were unlined and frequently burned. Zahrat al-Finjan centralized waste disposal by forcing over 85 municipalities to close local dump sites and to haul wastes to the landfill instead. In doing so, the PA made municipal waste its de facto property, rendering waste public at a national scale, and the PA itself all the more state-like for serving as custodian of the nation's wastes. What anthropologists Nikhil Anand, Akhil Gupta, and Hannah Apple call the promise of infrastructure that Zahrat al-Finjan offered was evident in the everyday affects and activities of its managers. Promoting landfills for Palestine, which they did among other things through YouTube videos like the one in this image and Facebook posts, was what Hamdi and Mu'tasim referred to as national Watani work. Zahrat al-Finjan often seemed like more of a calling than a job. It was a historic, unique opportunity to transform Palestine's physical environment, to create visible signs of modern statehood, and to work on Palestine at the, albeit much reduced, national scale. Preventing fires and dioxins from entering people's lungs made them sanitation pioneers in an undeveloped, disorderly landscape. It also meant impressing donors and Israeli officials who were always understood to be watching. Zahrat al-Finjan was, in these senses, a way for PA employees to perform what historian Dominique Laporte calls the transformation of shit into gold. Yet in other ways, the landfill was also toxic. Its toxicity came from the fact that it compressed thousands of tons of trash together in one place. When that much waste is gathered in one place, waste burial becomes an environmental risk. Landfills also devour land. They're one of the few infrastructures that grow in size over time. As what I call compression technologies, they are designed to constantly consume more waste, which in turn alters possible land use And in fact, I would propose that we think of landfills as storage sites rather than as disposal sites. Israel adds new Jewish-only housing in the West Bank nearly every day. So giving up private, usually agricultural land to store garbage was anathema to the ethical positions of many engineers like Hamdi and Mu'tasim, who nevertheless made the decision to do so. Waste burial is also toxic because it is not quite as modern as everyone said it was. And its chief proponents, Hamdi and Mu'tasim included, knew that well. These men were among Palestine's first expert waste managers, trained abroad or in recently established environmental engineering departments in Palestine, in Palestinian universities. They knew that there were other newer technologies such as heat coupling incinerators, like the one depicted here, that were possibly more appropriate for Palestine. Incinerators need less land because they transform waste into usable materials, and they can generate energy. This is particularly significant given that Palestinians are forced to purchase electricity from Israel. Hamdi and Mu'tasim also knew that landfills are being banned elsewhere, including in countries like Germany that were funding new Palestinian landfills. Finally, landfills are financially toxic. They're not as expensive to build as incinerators are, but running costs, consideration of future landfill expansion, and debt-based financing for land acquisition mean that landfills usually require whoever dumps waste there to pay what is called a tipping fee per load. Many municipalities simply could not pay or refused to do so. For Zahrat al-Finjan's managers, the financial strain resulted from the fact that the landfill had been built on a $9 million World Bank loan that was now due. The only way to pay it back was from the tipping fees, and the timeline for paying back the loan was based on World Bank funded designers' fanciful calculations about how many municipalities would dump there, what their population sizes would be in the future, how well the economy would be doing, and thus how much waste they would produce. These population projections were mistaken, it turned out. In the end, Jenin's population grew more quickly than anticipated and continued to be impoverished, which was not anticipated. Waste volumes did not increase as a result as quickly as anticipated, and many residents could not pay for basic services. Having closed dozens of municipal dump sites, however, Zahrat al-Finjan's operators could not reject municipal trucks that couldn't pay. Doing so would produce unregulated trash pileups again, and residents already critical of the PA would be watching, as would donors and Israel. So here lies the circularity of waste siege. One way that Zahrat al-Finjan's operators improvised to pay back the loan was by increasing the number of people whose waste was disposed of there from 200,000, for which the landfill had been designed, to 600,000 and then 1 million, hoping that other communities would pay and help cover the non-paying communities' costs. Suddenly, the landfill accepted waste from as far south as Ramallah, which was 2 hours away. But inviting unplanned for waste disposal meant that the landfill's lifespan was abruptly and irreversibly reduced from 30 years down to 15. Israeli prohibition on incineration, claiming it threatens Israeli security, and donor concerns that Palestinians lack the know-how to manage incinerators means that landfills are Palestinians' only current large-scale waste disposal option. A prematurely full landfill would thus force operators to expand the landfill sooner than expected. To slow the rate at which the landfill was now filling up, the operators decided to exclude bulky construction and demolition waste from landfill disposal. To temper the landfill's environmental risks and public concerns they raised, operators also excluded animal carcasses and medical wastes. I'll return to the effects of this in part 2. I want to emphasize here that in compressing waste to mitigate one set of dilemmas, Zahrat al-Finjan proliferated new waste-related dilemmas, enlisting new sets of actors to engage them. The dilemmas created and the actors enlisted were specific to the properties, both physical and semiotic, of both the wastes and the infrastructures designed to manage them. And importantly, all choices in relation to Zahrat al-Finjan were ambivalently made. In fact, one way to read my book is actually as an ethnography of ambivalence. One site experiencing surprising ambivalence is Shukba, a village of about 5,000 people. It's a 40-minute drive from Ramallah and surrounded by Israeli installations and trash mountains. Sadi, the secretary of Shukba's village council, took me through Shukba's valley in 2012. Shukba has been a dump site for at least 20 years for construction, hospital, and factory wastes from nearby Israeli settlements like Nili and Ofarim, and from across the Green Line. High tipping fees for industrial and construction waste in Israel have encouraged Israelis to dump illegally in the West Bank, where Israeli environmental laws do not apply. Shukba is also a dump site for Ramallah area construction and demolition debris, and for hospitals sending X-ray images to be burned down for their silver, as none of these wastes, as I mentioned, are permitted in the PA's formal landfills. Waste in Shukba is classically siege-like in that it surrounds, but it also emanates from within the village. Indeed, outward movement and blockage are perhaps two things that differentiate military siege from waste siege. Shukba residents have difficulty getting rid of their own wastes because of lacking infrastructures and because Israel polices or obstructs waste outward movements. The army also periodically confiscates Shukba's only garbage truck, and Shukba is further burdened by accumulations of its own buildings after Israel demolishes them. Donors, for their part, deem villages of Shukba's size too small for wastewater treatment plants. So without such infrastructures, residents have little choice but to send their own excrement flowing into the ground. Dumping occurs in parts of Shukba designated Area C. The two Israeli institutions monitoring Area C's environmental issues are the Civil Administration, which is a branch of the Israeli military that manages the West Bank, and the Associations for the Protection of the Environment of Judea and Samaria, two settler organizations. But while these actors evaluate, influence the designs of, and often obstruct construction of Palestinian infrastructure projects, they have done little to alleviate Shukba's waste-related burdens. The fact that Israel has jurisdiction over waste in Shukba will become important in part two, when I discuss how waste siege shapes socialities. Here, I want to highlight that Shukba's waste siege is circular because Shukban's attempts to mitigate accumulation's effects redistribute rather than eradicate waste's toxicities. At a physical level, this is the case because when they burn the waste mountains to reduce their size, they release dioxins. Shukbans have high rates of cancer, skin disease, respiratory illness, miscarriage, and impotence. The circularity also reveals itself socially in that years of economic degradation and unemployment have compelled some Shukbans to invite dump trucks to dump on their lands for a small fee. I return to this in a moment, but here I want to mention that complicities with siege are central to its circularity. If waste forms an ecology, which is something I argue in the book, it's as much a currency with which to manage life as it is a cause of damage. Waste with nowhere to go creates ethical roadblocks, as my next example demonstrates. So one of the most consistent features of Palestinian cityscapes is discarded bread. So much so that I'm now making a film about it with partners in Palestine. Bread bags hang off of rebar and awnings, tree branches, and fire hydrants. They rest in alcoves and inside piping. We might think of unwanted bread as the gold of the garbage world. But to extend the metaphor, it makes golden handcuffs. Bread is not only a staple food, it's also considered sacred across religious and socioeconomic groups. Its status means that bread should not be discarded. There's broad consensus on the ideal ways to treat excess bread, highest valued among them being use of all bread one procures, including by making dishes like a delicious salad called fattoush, some of you may know. It's common for people to scrutinize, comment upon, and intervene in each other's bread-related practices as people train themselves and others to make ethical decisions vis-a-vis bread. Yet people daily find themselves in possession of unwanted bread for a number of reasons that include changes in the modes of occupation, the occupied economy, and what many call the collapse of the national Palestinian movement, and which I'm happy to discuss further after the talk, thousands of people are unable to meet the ideal standards of excess bread reuse, becoming besieged with it every day. Bread deposits in these images are the compromise thousands of people have come up with for managing the dilemma this poses. But, and here is the ambivalence again, hanging bread outside is a solution with concessions. Lena, a university student with whom I spoke, for example, took out her household garbage every day. But she insisted that her mother carry out the separate bag of bread tied off to place on the dumpster handle. I beg my mother to take out the bread, she told me while giggling uncomfortably. Lena's admission was both funny and serious. It was funny and perhaps embarrassing that she needed her mother's help to take out the trash. But it was serious in that she was genuinely apprehensive about how to dispose of bread. Discarding it could make her a sinner, damaging her sense of herself. Lena's suggestion was that her mother was compromising herself ethically each day that she hung the bread outside. I believe that the fact that many who leave bread out feel torn about it is why I almost never witnessed anyone doing it. It was a compromise executed in furtive, stolen moments. The person who had done it knew she had failed to treat bread ethically, possibly not for the first time, and worried that someone might catch the bread's abandonment. I'll return to the story of bread in a moment. Here I want to emphasize two things. One, that inundation by too much of a good thing, in this case bread, is another feature of waste siege and can be understood as part of its circularity. And two, that casting bread away on public infrastructures was a compromised improvisation that always carried with it the potential to compound the compromise, whether by allowing the discarder to be seen or even just reminding her of her own failure to prevent the production of bread waste in the first place. So a shorter part two, infrastructures, the infrastructural and socialities. When I say that infrastructures are among people's improvisations for mitigating waste siege, in addition to using the popular sense of the term infrastructure, which evokes large-scale technological systems, I mean that other things, including waste itself, can become infrastructural. Valuable research on roads, oil, dams, and electric grids frames infrastructures as materials that make exchange over space possible and that connect faraway spaces to one another. My understanding of waste here resonates with discussions of the vibrancy or agency of non-human things. Yet my point is less that waste should be viewed as something possessing its own agency and more that it is infrastructural in that it too can facilitate flows, circulations, and distributions of people, goods, and ideas. Waste is what I think of as an enabler. In the time that remains, I'll discuss how waste becomes infrastructural and what it helps to generate. One byproduct of Zahrat al-Finjan's managers' attempts to deal with the landfill's besieging qualities was what I call landfill time. Inhabiting landfill time meant thinking in terms of a single landfill's lifespan. It extracted a temporal orientation from landfills' technical properties, for example, that landfills have expiration dates because they fill up. Landfill time anticipates change, but it also creates a suspended for now sensibility, similar to what James Fabian calls a for the time being temporality and what Vincent Ialenti calls a for the time being temporality, and what Vincent Ialenti calls the long now. Thinking of landfill's period of governance as a temporary, but for an uncertain Palestine long 30-year duration, allowed people like Hamdi and Mu'tasim, who in fundamental ways were actually opposed to landfills, to square their opposition with the impossibility of managing waste otherwise. It allowed them to suspend judgment enough to see establishing landfills as national work, thereby allowing further wastes to be compressed and for circularity to continue. Landfill time also shaped governing practices. In much of the world, landfills and other waste disposal infrastructures come with efforts to shape populations' behaviors, such as recycling and environmental awareness campaigns. In Palestine, because they treated waste burial as a practice with an expiration date, Hamdi and Mu'tasim saw themselves as waiting to deal with trickier behavior-altering issues like awareness and recycling practices of what Arun Agrawal calls environmentality until a future date when landfills would be closer to closing. This could placate communities already aggravated by landfills and gave my PA interlocutors a sense of their own governing style as patient, beneficent, and even non-interventionist. Landfill time served as the suspended temporality of state building while everyone waited for the state. Mr. El-Masri, Shukba's village council head, told me that he had been writing letters requesting help from various PA offices. Nothing had come of it. The PA failed to respond in part because it lacks jurisdiction in Area C. What struck me most was that the actors to whom Shukba appealed least, the Israeli army, settlers, and international donors, were those with the greatest ability to help. Of course, you might say, why would you ask your oppressors for help? I assumed this was the logic, but Sari and others corrected me in Shukba. Shukba's council had asked for Israeli assistance, in fact, with other issues like connecting homes to an electric grid and relocating an electric tower. There was something different about waste. It was generative in a different way than other infrastructural substrates like electricity and water are generative. Sadi explained that with waste, there's always someone involved. Waste, especially when its accumulations are intense, disorderly, and enduring, contains or embodies questions not only about responsibility, for instance, the way we understand the responsibility to provide energy or clean water, but also about culpability. According to Derrida, Lévi-Strauss, and Rousseau, supplementarity both describes that which is external to an object and supplies that which is missing from it. The external is always already inscribed within that which is then added. People, I would argue, serve as supplements to wastes accumulated as they are in Shukba, in the sense that people are external to the waste, but are also part of its formation and thus remain attached to it. Water, by contrast, may be produced through human action, as the work of scholars like Andrea Ballestero and Jesse Barnes has shown. But as a resource perceived to be natural, water provokes fewer questions about culpability. Water can stand on its own, I would argue, but waste cannot. Shukba's siege was thus double, made of wastes themselves and of the muqawilin, which is the Arabic word used for Shukba's intermediaries who were benefiting from the dumping. It was the social rot of the muqawilin that most perturbed Sadi and his colleagues and that tied their hands. With issues of waste, Sadi said, it has to do with the muqawil. He's from the same village, and I can, as a son of the village, write a letter against him or a complaint to the PA. That is acceptable. But that I would write a letter of complaint against him to the Israeli Authority, then you have betrayal. It was the muqawilin's role in Shukba's accumulations that precluded asking the military for help, in other words. And I realized this was likely why, when Sadi and Mr. Al-Masri had pulled out a stack of complaint letters called Shakawi, Mr. Al-Masri had asked for my patience. Sadi had blackened some words with a marker as he had photocopied each letter. Once Mr. Al-Masri had handed me the papers, I saw that Sadi had been concealing muqawilin names. In my book, I discuss the letter's content and language, especially the council's repeated references to the PA's national duty to help Shukba. I call this an incomplete interpellation. By this, I mean that Shukbans hailed PA officials into shared national belonging, attempting to trigger a sense of obligation in the latter. These interpellations were incomplete, though. They failed to produce the desired results. Yet they created opportunities for articulating boundaries and relationships between the PA and local governments, like Shukba, that the PA had actually created to carry out its vision in the 1990s. Some of my interlocutors called the resulting experience a shibh dawla, or phantom state. A shibh dawla describes Palestinians' experiences of the PA as the governing body to which appeals are made, even when the PA fails to act. It describes the unspoken acknowledgement that Israel remains sovereign, but must nevertheless be ignored, at least in matters of waste. Shukba's waste accumulations were infrastructural, you might say, for the phantom state, and waste accumulations invite people to call upon the phantom state. The phantom state is thus one face of toxicity in a place like Shukba, but toxicity is also arguably what gives smell, specificity, and most importantly, continuity to the phantom state. When unwanted bread hangs off of public infrastructures, it displays bread possessors' failure to do their ethical duty. Yet, outdoor infrastructures like awnings do relieve people's senses of besiegedness by offering an albeit compromised way to cast bread away. Infrastructures like awnings and dumpster handles become a place for matter with no place to go, where that matter is both away and not. They also sometimes create unpredictable circulations, both of bread and of shared ways of thinking. Some people do take bread left out. While driving one day through the back streets of Albire, my friend Mustafa and I encountered a shepherd. The shepherd had stopped his goats on a stony open plot of land. Of course he took the bread he found outside, he said. He broke it into pieces and spread it across a plot like this one. His goats loved it. Even people who said they had never taken cast-off bread said they knew why people did it. That knowing was rooted in a sense of shared ethical orientation captured by the phrase most people use to explain why there was bread on the streets. You can't throw it away. This is why I think we can say that bread deposits mediate urban public life, facilitating flows of people and ideas across space. In other words, following the definition of infrastructure offered to us, for example, by anthropologist Brian Larkin. Left out, bread is endowed with the power to interpolate, even if incompletely here too. It addresses an audience, hailing humans and other organisms who want or need it to take it. Because the style of bread leaving is such a pervasive phenomenon, bread informs passersby that the person who placed it there shares a sense of moral constraint around treatment of bread, with others who might consider doing the same. In this sense, cast-off bread makes public locations like ledges and walls sites for individuals to perform care for and belonging to an imagined stranger collectivity. One of the most important ideas that this bread practice helps make circulate is that such a collectivity exists at all, an idea that's particularly powerful in an extended moment many are characterizing as the collapse of the Palestinian national movement, which I mentioned earlier. Bread collectivity's nature then resonates with what Anna Singh calls a latent commons. For her, latent commons are ubiquitous because, quote, we rarely notice them and they are undeveloped. They bubble with unrealized possibilities and are elusive. My interlocutors did not view casting off bread, writing shikawi, and landfill time as political gestures. They were not gestures consciously aimed at challenging colonial subjecthood. They were ways for what James Fabian calls troubled optimists to live with waste siege that also sometimes rendered responsibility for both waste and military siege indeterminate. Yet these imperfect improvisations should not be taken for signs of complacency. Improvisation implies making do, but with an emphasis on making. Social formations organized around specific cultural brokers, collectivities, temporalities, and mediators coalesce when Palestinians improvise to adapt to this emergent form of siege. As existing forms of community are diminished or rearranged in Palestine, other forms of collectivity may be emergent as supplements to existing forms. So in closing, I want to scale up and out from Palestine. If waste siege describes the state of stateless Palestine, it also is a metaphor for our besieged planet. It's a matter of proportions in finite space. The proportion of wastes to habitable Earth is growing. Waste siege offers a way to think about that and the fact that, for example, radioactive materials are leaking out of nuclear power plants as we speak in Japan, France, and New York, and that such leakages, like other waste types that humans produce, like plastic bags, are outpacing technologies for minimizing their effects. My hope is that this book makes a case for thinking of refuse and excreta, toxic and troublesome as they may sometimes be, also as animating, culturing environments for socialities, ethics, and politics. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much, Sophia, for that's a lot of food for thought. If I may just start the discussion with one question, and then we can open up the floor for more questions. First of all, I've got to say this is a really fresh perspective on the topic of humanitarian crises. Like, it made me realize how much efforts of humanitarian health center on food supply, for instance, and this is a really fresh perspective on, say, other aspects of human life, if you will, in occupied territories. Now, my question, or kind of a different angle that I wanted to ask about, in your book, you also talk a bit about other cities within the territories of Israel, like namely Jerusalem. There's a small part close to the end, and I'm wondering how your arguments would relate to, say, mixed cities inside the territories of Israel, indeed, like Jerusalem. Or I think better examples would actually be Haifa or Jaffa, where you've got even mixed neighborhoods where Jewish Israelis and Israeli Arabs live together. I mean, if looking at the infrastructure there, what would it do to your argument?
Yeah, it's a great question. You would think that I've gotten this question before, but I haven't. Yeah, I think, on the one hand, at the level of kind of, if you take it phenomenologically, like Palestinians living in East Jerusalem or in Jaffa, for example, it's known that they receive services that are inferior around waste management to those that Jewish Israelis receive. So you could say that waste siege would ostensibly apply there. That in fact, in one city, you have sort of one part experiencing waste siege and one part not experiencing it. On the other hand, I am making in this last slide, I am making a point about the planetary scale. And, I think on the one hand, Palestinians in the West Bank are kind of quite aware of their own inundation, like what I'm describing in this presentation. And I guess part of my realization as I was doing this research was that the rest of us are also in this kind of at a planetary scale, but only some of us are aware of it. And that's partly to do with how how distant our infrastructures can make waste feel for us. So I think Israel, I haven't done my research directly on Israel and Israeli society, of course, but my sense is that there's an understanding of Israeli technology as something that's really going to bring solutions to matters of waste, energy, water, etc. So there's that kind of techno-optimism that probably occludes the sense of besiegedness that maybe people should really be considering. On the other hand, I think that, the fact that Israel hasn't declared its borders formally probably also gives a nice sense of expansion to a society that, like all societies, will meet finitude at some point with the amount of waste it generates. But for now, anyway, that sense of kind of possible flexibility and expansion, especially into the West Bank, of course, I imagine helps. But I think that's also a settler colonial feature, right? So the United States, it's interesting when you look at where there are landfills in industrialized countries, they tend to be in settler colonies. There's something there around the kind of expansive frontier possibilities and the sense that you can just keep dumping and it'll be away from you, whereas other places like Japan and Germany have kind of gathered, have decided that spatial reduction is really important in terms of waste. I think it's a great question. Yeah.
I'm sure there are lots of other questions. We've got about 20 minutes for discussion, so I'm happy to take the questions as Simon Pirani.
So thanks very much for a really interesting talk. I think there's three questions, but they're all joined together, and they also follow on, I think, from Yael's question. I mean, the first thing is, could you say more about the phantom state, because your talk got really interesting at that moment for me, in the sense that so I've got a friend who's been working in Bethlehem for about 15 years now, so I've visited quite a lot, and one of the things I remember is talking to this left-wing Palestinian guy. We were sitting discussing the whole situation. This is a long time ago, about 10 years ago. And the guy said, look, we should just throw it all away, and we should demand we'd be better under the Geneva Convention. We'd be better under the requirements that the Geneva Convention puts on an occupying power. We shouldn't do this Palestinian Authority thing at all. And I mean, I know that's not an isolated opinion, right? There's a body of Palestinian opinion because of the completely impossible situation that the PA is caught in. And I imagine that in a question like waste, you can see that dynamic very clearly, and you have touched on it anyway. So I wonder if you could say more about that. And then a second and related thing, and related to Yael's question, is about the settlements, because another thing that I really clearly remember from one of my visits is my friend took us to the market in Hebron, and this is really shocking, because you have settler families who've been installed above this basically sort of covered market, if you can imagine, and they chuck their waste down, and there are nets. So you've got a typical covered market in a Middle Eastern country. You've got a sort of walkway and stalls absolutely crammed on both sides, and there are nets over the top. And the reason these nets are there is to try and limit the amount of rubbish, literally, that is thrown down by these settlers who live physically above the market. And anyway, remembering that in your talk, I wondered, what actually happens to the waste from all the settlements? Because I bet they don't keep it within the settlements. So that was a second question. And a third question, it's going off onto a slightly different tangent, but I wonder if in your work, and I'm sorry I haven't read your book, but water, right? Which must be a connected issue, and water is what is desperately short throughout Israel, Palestine, and so on. Thanks.
Thank you so much for those questions. The phantom state, I guess I'll start by saying that when I started this project, I remember people at my university in my PhD program saying, but the PA really isn't anything, why would you study the PA? Because I was thinking that waste would be a great way for me to understand what the PA does and is. So there has been analytically a way of thinking about the PA as a kind of, either as kind of completely powerless and therefore of no consequence, and therefore we're still just going to talk about Palestinians and the Israeli military and sort of ignore the PA. Some people have indicted the PA for its kind of role in what's called outsourcing the occupation, that the PA sort of does the bidding of Israel, which is often true, especially around security, and now has developed its own kind of censorship of Palestinian media, et cetera. But almost no one was talking about what it did otherwise and what Palestinians thought about the PA, other than thinking it's corrupt or other than thinking, it should go. I wanted to understand at the level of the everyday what the sort of sense of governance the PA has produced for people. And so I felt like really interested and surprised, I guess, but also finally helped by this term that came from my interlocutors, which is this phantom state idea, where it's sort of like is and isn't there at the same time, and I wanted to sort of front load that in my analysis to say, there can be these governments that are both kind of present and kind of selectively used and ignored, or where that also means that people, among the governed, affects can actually become charged around this entity that you expect things from. So, once you expect things from a certain government, that also has huge implications for politics, right? It means you're expending your energies and doing political organizing around that rather than something else, or, so that I was really interested in kind of responsibility and accountability and how people were thinking about it. And then finally, I'll just say, in this case, I was so struck that you really saw that the PA was sort of called upon at the very same time as there was an awareness over many, many years that the PA would do nothing. So here you have the residents of Shukba sort of producing the phantom state in their calls upon it. you know, so it sort of legitimizes its existence as the address for demands for certain kinds of rights, you know, to be secured in some way. And that's a kind of suspended way to behave, right? Because it's like, you know, it's not going to get you anywhere, but it feels like the only way to go. And that's partly because you acknowledge all the time that there is a different sovereign in the background that must be ignored. And I thought it was interesting that waste seemed to be a little bit different, as I mentioned, in terms of kind of triggering the presence of the PA in a certain way, or maybe making it more robust, because in some other domains of infrastructural management, like water and electricity, speaking of water, they're just so much more squarely controlled by Israel, that kind of direct demand can be issued, or, you know, that's when you go to the international organization. So that's, to me, also kind of interesting, that around waste, it's only quite recently that you find Palestinians approaching international organizations to try, like NGOs, to try to get support around environmental issues, whereas around water, roads, etc., there's been a kind of direct line out, which is also why I chose waste in a way, because it was the thing I was least hearing about among activists or in the development world. And settlers, I mean, you're right. You know, for the most part, it's a pretty ugly story. Settlements, you know, both, yeah, they tend to produce the waste that industrialized societies produce, which is more, as I mentioned, than poor communities. And it tends to be pushed out of the settlements. In any case, the settlements themselves are on Palestinian land. So even if they were to keep their waste, they would still be producing the waste siege. They would just be experiencing it more intensely themselves, but it would still be having an effect on the water, for example. So a lot of it, though, does go out, both the solid waste and a lot, especially sewage, goes out into Palestinian areas, residential areas, and agricultural areas. And one thing I talk about in the book that's really important is the topography of the West Bank, and the fact that it's mountainous, and a lot of the waste that's produced goes across the Green Line and into Israel. And so that kind of triggers a new dynamic, again, because of the existence of the phantom state, which is quite solid to the Israeli policy community. It's treated, you know, the PA is treated as almost as state-like in many ways. So the wastes that flow across into the Green Line are termed pollution by the PA, and then are become a cause for charging the PA a lot of money as a polluter. So there's a kind of macro politics and a micro politics, you know, part where villages are constantly having to reckon with the fact that there's sewage kind of flooding their orchards, and that's very hard to get anyone to account for. And then water, I guess I said a little bit, you know, on the one, I don't know exactly what you want to know about water. Yes, water is very important. It was interesting to see when I first arrived in Palestine, to talk to engineers and to have them tell me, you're going to have to choose if you're working on water, wastewater and water, which is a category for engineers, or on solid waste. And I kind of defied them and kept solid waste and wastewater together in my analysis, but both considered, of course, environmental and water pollutants and hazards. But I would say that that wastewater, because of its physical properties, it tending to move and seep at greater rates, and also because wastewater is considered a resource that's fought over, right? Because if you treat it, you can reuse it for agriculture. That has a kind of different set of tensions and politics around who controls those infrastructures. Yeah, but there's tons more to say about water, but I didn't write about water. And that was partly because I did think that we needed to hear about what we don't hear about in Palestine.
I believe we have another question from David.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sophia. It was a fascinating paper. I have a question about the relationship between waste and production. You know, you'd think that people who couldn't just throw away their waste, and where it became evident, as you say, that you're accumulating it rather than disposing of it, you'd think they would produce less of it and consume less of it. maybe particularly, plastic packaging and so on. So I wonder if that's going on at all. And to the extent that it's not happening, to the extent that people are not reducing, is there something about the powerlessness of occupation that makes it difficult to control the commodity chain of packaging and other forms of waste, which is why it's piling up? Thank you.
That's such a great question. And it's definitely something I thought about a lot. What I would say intervenes here is, like you said, occupation, but I wouldn't call it powerlessness. I would say that what's going on here in terms specifically of packaging and also imports, because a lot of the materials that come into the West Bank that are used and discarded in the West Bank are not produced in the West Bank. So I would say that the number one cause of this kind of control over production not being centered in everyday life in Palestine is the PA's desire to make life seem as normal as possible in Palestine and to present itself as state-like as possible. So in the mid-1990s, the PA signed another agreement called the Paris Protocol, where it was it made it possible, this protocol, for any Palestinian business person in the West Bank to import from basically anywhere in the world. And this had a hugely damaging effect on local Palestinian production, for example, of textiles and shoes and other things. So people started to import from places like China, and because the economy never came to a good place in Palestine after Oslo, people were importing as cheaply as they could, whatever goods they could, but there was that sense of a kind of global market Palestinians were now a part of, so people were buying a lot more frequently and newer things. There was a kind of fetish of the new that developed. So you had a kind of normal consumer society produced out of the Oslo Accords. And I think the PA was really, really invested in keeping that going. So I think there would have been hesitation around limiting those conveniences of being able to buy like a very cheap pair of sneakers or, the super packaged object. So I think the kind of desire to present stateness both outwardly and inwardly, I would say was probably the cause of that kind of hesitation. And the other thing that I noticed among specifically waste management engineers that really struck me, especially because they knew that recycling and recycling is a thing. They traveled to Japan, they knew about the 20 different bins in Japan and the kind of discipline it took. And there was a kind of self-judgment or, a kind of racism, I guess, against Palestinian society that was coming out of the Palestinian engineers who saw themselves as sort of elites. And they would say like, Palestinians can't do this. They can't possibly be asked to put, whatever, the plastic here and the aluminum here, in their homes. So this is sort of where landfill time comes in for me. They kind of said, we're going to do landfilling for now. It's temporary. And then at some later date, we'll be higher tech in terms of our incinerators, and we'll also have a developed civilization, essentially, that will be able to recycle. But there was a kind of, that kind of assumption of inferiority, cultural inferiority that was part of it.
I think we have another question from Nora.
Hi, thanks so much for the talk today, Sophia. I have a question. It was really interesting to hear you elaborate on waste siege and the idea of siege and how it sort of is present in all these different aspects of waste in the West Bank. But of course, we usually hear siege in the context of Gaza. And so I wonder if I could sort of poke at a bigger question of how looking at and understanding and sort of nuancing this concept of siege maybe expands how we think about it or connects sort of its use when people do talk about Gaza and now in this context of the West Bank, right? What are you sort of playing with or maybe driving us to think about in your use of the term?
Yeah, thank you so much, Nora. I mean, I think one of the things that struck me, even though I said earlier in my different answer that Palestinians are aware of their own inundation by various kinds of waste in the West Bank, I would say at the same time, one of the effects of waste siege is that the perpetrator is not clear. And that takes me back a little bit to the phantom state, where there's a kind of there's a kind of obfuscation or confusion around where to place blame in waste siege. That is, in my view, when I think about military sieges, is not the case, right? You know who is besieging you. You know, it is ex-army, or here it's like the Israelis and the Egyptians in Gaza. And so I guess one of the things I'm thinking about is how sieges can be perpetrated by different, or caused or enabled by different types of forces, one being a military and one being waste, let's say. Although, of course, waste isn't doing this on its own. Waste is sort of an outcome and an actor all at the same time in the West Bank. But I'm thinking about the way that waste siege, which obfuscates the perpetrator of waste siege itself, also obfuscates other kinds of siege, like military siege. So in the West Bank, you have people kind of feeling themselves to be under a state with the PA in a way that might, I guess what I'm saying is, in my view, their energies would be better spent, directly paying attention to what Israel does, or what the international donors do. So I guess I'm thinking, we could find a waste siege in Gaza, which is certainly present, and think about how it intersects with the military siege that's also there, how it possibly sort of redirects politics or shapes people's senses of who is to blame. And actually this whole project started partly, and I think I start with this in my book, because I saw an article from 2007 about a sewage container, a big concrete container in Gaza that broke and overflowed, of course, because the Israelis weren't allowing things like concrete to repair it. So it broke, it overflowed, it flooded a village, and several people were killed in that village. And when the a PA minister showed up to the village to try to help, they chased him out with guns blazing. So that idea that sort of when it comes to waste, you suddenly see your occupied government as to blame somehow interrupts what could be a different kind of politics that we saw in the 1980s. I mean, I think partly I'm probably carrying a certain kind of nostalgia that a lot of Palestinians carry about the kind of intifadas of the 1980s and the way that it felt clear whom you wanted to boycott and kind of what kind of politics you wanted to pursue. And I think what everybody's been wondering about the period after the 1990s is what happened to political organizing in Palestine, and why is it so fragmented, and what happened to it? So thank you. I mean, I think there's more to say there kind of theoretically about the nature of siege, but I think I need to think more about it.
We do need to finish quite soon, but Sophia, I would love to hear more about your new project. It just sounds so fascinating. I mean, I would love to know how those two projects kind of relate to each other, and why you chose Athens as, the new location that you researched.
So the new project in many ways feels of course very different. Airbnb in Greece and in Athens in particular. I think some connectors for me are my interest in infrastructure and what it does. And in the Airbnb case, and sort of multiple kinds, sort of the soft and hard infrastructures interacting with each other. I will say, I'm still developing the kind of theoretical core of that project. I chose Athens, I'll just tell you, because I wanted to work in a place where I could be with my family and my young child, for this moment, although I have kind of future Palestine-related projects now up my sleeves again. But one interesting connection I discovered, which made me feel very grateful for having done the Palestine research, was that there are actually a lot of Israeli and Palestinian investors in Athens real estate since the crisis. And a lot of those investors are putting those properties on Airbnb. So I'm interested in the way that homes are actually being remade both in Greece and in Israel and Palestine through this kind of new set of processes facilitated by Airbnb. So I've ended up doing some field work actually in Israel, especially in Israel actually among investors, and it's been a very interesting process. So, you know, I think the last thing to say is, you know, how impoverished we are when we work only on one location. And, you know, the Palestine project, this Waste Siege book, certainly could have been a kind of multi-site project where I'm with people in Japan or in Germany and, you know, understanding how they've developed the ideas about the technologies that they have developed. So I'm hoping that with this new project, I'm thinking more globally in that way that many of us do with second projects, actually. So I'll look forward to writing it and sharing it.
Okay, great. Yeah, well, hopefully you can come and visit us in Durham and we could meet you in person.
I would love that. I would love that.
In the future. Okay, so thank you very much, Sophia, and I hope you all will continue following the Center of Culture and Ecology. There are, you know, the ongoing talks about related topics.